Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy. And our guest today is Father David McCallum, a Jesuit priest currently serving in the Vatican, who has played many roles. He's been a professor and an administrator in the Jesuit higher education at the Lemoyne College in Syracuse. And he is the executive director of the Discerning Leadership program, which offers guidance and training for clergy at many levels. And he's also a very broadly educated and big picture thinker, someone who's been a student and expert actually in topics like adult development and Ken Wilber's integral theory. So he brings a lot of different elements and facets to a consideration of all things. And he's devoted his life to the church. So David, there are a lot of topics to be covered. Religion in today and the church today are going through so many changes. But let's start personally. Please say something about how you came to devote your life to the Catholic Church.
Oh my gosh, what a mystery that is. Yeah, Roger, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you after years and you and John. Um, I was raised Catholic, but a post-Vatican II Catholic. Jesus
Mhm.
was my close friend, and I never had any sense of the fear that people had grown up with in a pre-Vatican II church. The sense that I had was that this was a welcoming and really a nurturing place and community to be part of. And I never thought about priesthood as a younger person, but attending a Jesuit college, I was studying humanities, and actually our program was called the Integral Honors Program. This would be back in the late 80s, and we had Jesuits who were chaplains and professors, brilliant guys who loved their subjects and loved us. And I had one particular experience early on of a retreat where I felt that I thou experience in quite a profound way. In a way that from that point on, I knew that I needed to factor that in to whatever and whoever I would become. But what it would mean, had no idea. But from that point on, I was on the radar of the Jesuits and was then shoulder tapped a few times to think about this. And gradually, after a couple of years of a lot of, I'd say cold feet and then kind of approach avoidance, I eventually couldn't deny that something really deep was attracting me. I did an honors project looking at the fiction of Graham Greene, if you know his
Mhm.
fiction, and
Spy
you know,
stuff, right?
yeah,
International.
spy stuff, and also looking at these protagonists who are very muddled in their kind of moral character, and people of faith and of tremendous doubt. Very human, very very much a kind of product of their times in the modern era, and asking the deep existential questions, of the 21st and 20th century. And I really had this insight that I didn't want to end up like a lot of these characters who were just filled with egotism, and it betrayed who they were and who they wanted to be, as well as their relationships. And for me, I had enough insight into myself as a young person to see I could end up that way. I don't want to end up with,
Mhm.
my vanity and greed and kind of achievement orientation getting the best of me. And I also knew that I needed a community to help me along the way. I needed a community, I needed a spirituality that brought me into a more direct relationship with God, that taught me how to sort through the motivations and the kind of urges that I was experiencing, and that would lead me deeper into freedom. And the heart of kind of our Jesuit spirituality is a deep, deep invitation to spiritual freedom, freedom from attachments that are unhelpful, uh, freedom from the kind of emotional disorder that early traumas can bring, and that we experience when we're unconditionally but conditionally loved. So by the time I was 21, I made the choice to enter the Society of Jesus. And in fact, it was exactly the experience of being as a college student in 1989, hearing that the Jesuits had been assassinated in El Salvador, in San Salvador in the fall of 1989, that I was really feeling like, okay, this is going to have consequences, and I want to have a life that has consequence. So that was my naive beginning, I would say. The story from then on, 35 years later, has been a really interesting adventure. So, yeah.
And what a,
Can I say what I need to say, Roger, so we can get on to
yeah.
the other stuff? I'm great for getting off script if we had one, but that's me. But the last few days preparing for this has been very transformative, and that's the name of the game here, deep transformation. So, give you a little background. I had a very powerful spiritual awakening when I was 12 years old, reading the New Testament. I grew up Catholic, by the way. I'm
Mm,
definitely a cultural Catholic, and all of a sudden, I had the experience that God is love and God is everywhere, and it just like I thought this was an important thing anybody could know. And why didn't they ever tell me about that in church? So
mm,
I never dawned in my mind to go to a priest to get, counseling and everything. So one thing led to another. I ended up a couple of years later joining a religious cult for about 8 years. And then I joined the army and got out of there. I wanted something to really break. I wanted to burn the bridge, and that was a good choice. And anyway, so I was just struggling with God, the whole thing. And I says, I don't care. I want the truth that there is no God, there is God. But I just didn't, I was so full of this cult stuff that I had to get free of that. And then a few years later, I mean, I was spiritual, not, spirituality came to the fore in my life. We had this integral Christianity thing, and Brother David Stindl Rass was there in Boulder, Colorado. And some woman had a breakthrough or a breakdown and really touched me, and he gave her a hug. And I said, "Can I have a hug too?" I usually don't say that kind of thing, but he did. And I said, "Where were you 40 years ago?"
mm,
And he said, "This hug goes back 40 years." And I was
mm,
like, "Oh, you know, thank you." And that really did something in my heart. It was a step forward for me. And in preparation for this, um, well, we've been doing these conversations with A.H. Almas or Hamid, and
yeah.
he's an amazing man. But one of the things he said in the book that we're going through with him, he says that you can't practice your way to enlightenment. And he says, in fact, practice sometimes will just reinforce the separate self.
Yeah.
And Roger and I practice a lot. And so I was like, oh, great. And I kind of knew that, but when I was reading your website, here's the point of all this, which I really liked, by the way. Did you write the copy?
Mm,
It's very good. Everybody should look at it. I was very touched. And again, I thought, wow, if I'd have seen this kind of church when I was growing up, I'd probably still be there. But I was, this is where it's all very personal, but I read the phrase, I think it's an opening to grace.
mm,
And I just went, oh, that's the answer to the koan about practice won't get you enlightenment and can make you reinforce a separate self. The practice is opening to grace.
yeah.
And I was deeply moved. And instead of, got to practice today, since then, I can't wait to go and just open myself to God, if you will. And I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to let you know how what you're writing and what you're doing, it sounds so healthy. It sounds very Quakerly in some ways, which is a group I have respect for. But if
Mm,
that's the direction of the church, uh, thank you. Oh, and one last thing is
mm,
that when my country does bad stuff, I feel really bad, okay, because I'm American. When my church, albeit separated, does bad things, I feel very bad. I take it all personally. It hurts. So with that, I'll just, uh,
mm.
you know.
John, when you spoke, I just want to just honor the opening in your heart that was happening, and just to invite you to allow yourself the willingness for your own vulnerability to stay there with that when you do feel that, because the trying, right, that all of us are tempted to do to kind of, in a sense, bridge the gap. It's always going to be counterproductive to the work that God wants to do on our behalf. This initiative that I think God wants to take with us. And I don't know, growing up, as a very individualistic American male, um, the whole logic of surrendering to grace, to accepting grace, is so difficult to just kind of get our heads and hearts wrapped around. But for me, I feel like it's the journey worth making, right? The journey of surrender, the journey of opening, the journey of kind of allowing ourselves to be held and to be supported and to be loved, as David Stendhal Ross was embracing you that day, and transmitting that kind of love in a very incarnate way, that God, I think, wants to give to all of us, wants all of us to feel as beloved children, and yeah, I think that's ultimately the message of Christ. Um,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
I was also reflecting on Mark chapter 16, which the scholar says was added later, but be that as it may, it's what's come down to us. And Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every living creature. And I was thinking, every living creature. That means my dog, the squirrels, the cats, the bugs, everything. And like giving out that love, not just um, making it exclusive for humans, but for all creatures. And St. Francis had a big impact on my life. And that's what Francis used to do. There's a famous thing where he preached to the birds. And that was a really nice opening for me. I just started feeling more love when I was walking my dog this morning. Just, it's not, there's humans we got to fix and there's everything else. No, it's all God. And the gospel includes all of it. So,
yeah. I mean, we may be in a kind of a detour, as you said right now, but what Ignatius of Loyola suggested is that God is in all things. And so there's this panentheistic way of holding this simultaneous sense that creation, right, has been generated in some way. It's a mystery. And at the same time, God can be found in all of it. And that we have the senses, and we've been given the intellect, we've been given the sensibility, to perceive that presence, and to in fact even pursue or allow it to come to us, in ways that are just as close up, right, as your interaction with the people in your family, the walk in the nature. Yeah, exactly, exactly.
amen.
Amen.
This is a very, in some ways, a different understanding of religion from conventional understandings. Certainly not. I'm trying to lost for the right word. It's let's just say it's not the message that is most frequently heard, and yet it's so beautiful, it's so encompassing, so loving, so, as you said, panentheistic, David. Yeah.
Well, I think that most of us have only had experiences of the exoteric religion, the institutional religion, but often transmitted through rituals and practices and community, but often lacking the substance of a deep spirituality. So yes, we have the comfort of kind of repeated rituals and prayers and things like that, but often, in a sense, disconnected from this deeper wellspring. And I think that one of the benefits of the many spiritualities that are within the Christian sort of sphere, is that they're often originated in founding figures who had a very particular experience of God at a particular time. And they were able to, in some ways, give expression to that in a way that people felt it spoke to them. And Ignatius was one of those people, Teresa of Avila, Francis of Assisi, Dominic, these founders and foundresses of often religious congregations. And there was often not just an experience of God, but also a sense of mission that grew out of that. Some sense of wanting to respond to this gratuitous love, this experience of wholeness, this experience of forgiveness in a way that was then shared with others. And, that's the way I would think a good spirituality, is expressed. It's not something that's just only for oneself, but it's meant to be a gift for others as well. So, yeah, there's a lot to say about Ignatian spirituality, of course, as there is about, every religious tradition and every spirituality. But you could get me on for this for a long time. I'm just warning you. So,
Yeah, we want to talk about the work you're doing. I also want to talk about Francis is no longer the living pope, and we have a new pope, and that's important to me. And so far, I like him, and I think that he's American is really cool because I think that was consciously done by spirit or by somebody, and that he's a mixed race, has a Creole background from New Orleans. It's
yeah.
just about perfect, and he's been very, very like he's really supported Ukraine and come out and I know you can't say anything negative. He's your boss, but anyway, Francis was a really important figure, and for me anyway, for millions obviously, but toward the end, I think it was the whole sexual abuse thing that kind of just really hurt him. He was in Peru. He got off the plane. Instead of having all these people cheering and everything, a bunch of angry people with signs, and
Mm,
he got angry. This is a story I've heard. It's a documentary. And he said, okay, well, I'm going to have my people investigate it. And it was all very true.
mm,
So I think he was deeply hurt by that, as many of us have been. And uh, yeah, and now he's gone. Phenomenal person. But now we have a new man who lived in Peru for years, and I guess he has dual citizenship now. He became one with his people, his flock, if you will. So, any comments that can have about that?
yeah. Well, Pope Francis, was a Jesuit brother of ours.
That's right. First Jesuit, a pope.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and probably the last. Um, None of us ever expected a Jesuit to be Pope because we take a special vow of obedience to the Pope. It's our fourth vow, and it's one of
Mhm.
the things that makes the Jesuits kind of distinct. So the folklore for us, growing up in the Jesuits was it'll never happen, and so none of us ever gave it a thought. And when Francis was elected, in fact, I was the dean of a business school, and my associate dean, we were in a strategy meeting, and he said, "Oh, we have a pope, and he's a Jesuit." And I slammed my fist down on the table. I said, "That's impossible." Well, one of the many ways I'm wrong, and initially, I think there was fear from Jesuits, especially in the United States, about Francis because his reputation in South America was very mixed, a very strong leader, but divisive. He used his authority in a very strong way on behalf of the poor, but also during the course of the Argentinian Dirty War, he made decisions that seemed contrary to
Right.
the Jesuits who were working for liberation theology. And so there was a sense of not knowing exactly what to expect. And Francis even had been in exile at one point, after a kind of divisive time in his own province. He was in Cordoba for 2 years, basically in a kind of spiritual retreat, but also in exile. And I think it was during that period of time that he began to do some soul searching about his own exercise of authority. And then years later, as an archbishop and then a cardinal, and really exploring the way in which the church was operating in South America, what began to be clear to him is that we have to make a change around the way that authority and participation are balanced. And there was, I think, an incredible groundswell of support for this shift that would expand participation and enhance the diversity of decision making in the church. And he brought that to Rome. He was, in a sense, hired when in the conclave to be a reformer, to reform the Roman Curia, and potentially to bring this South American vision into reality in Rome. So, from the start, I think he was set up to be someone who would not be necessarily making things easy for everyone, but be a prophetic figure, be a challenging figure. And I had the privilege of working with him directly in a couple of ways on this process of synodality, which we might talk about some more.
If
Um,
I'll shut up, yeah, we'll get there, right?
yeah, in fact, during both of these synods, he was there and available after our lunch break, and it happened to be my mom's birthday in the middle of these two October gatherings. And he lit up every time that people wanted to do something very personal and very down to earth with him. He was not a big fan of the formalities and things like that. And I asked him to do a video for my mom's birthday. He did it 2 years in a row.
That's awesome.
Just made her day. It was just funny and personal and very kind. But he also recognized his imperfections. He didn't hide them from people. He wanted people to have controversies out in the open instead of in the back channels. Part of the shift he wanted to catalyze for the church was to really help people to realize ideological perspectives distance people from reality. And so, more important than ideology, no matter how powerful, is to get people into direct encounter with others, to have real dialogue, to have the opportunity to sort through our assumptions together, and to do that in a respectful and caring way, guided by the Spirit. So he introduces the importance of discernment, of listening to the Spirit within ourselves, between ourselves, amongst us, and then following where that Spirit wants to lead us, which is to more life, which is to more fruitfulness, which is to greater joy. In fact, he wrote a whole encyclical on joy. So Francis, played a very important role, I think, at a particular time. Not perfect, as you say. He would apologize when he made mistakes, which is unprecedented for popes. In fact,
Absolutely.
he really opened up this new way of being Vatican. By the way, I should clarify, I don't work directly for the Vatican. I have run a program that is in service to the Vatican and others who are headquartered here in Rome. But Francis had a way of introducing a whole new key in which to read basically how we are church. And that's this business of,
And he never stayed in the papal apartments. He stayed in the guest house the whole time he was Pope. I mean,
yeah.
what a man. That's such a great statement.
And part of it is, not only his simplicity, which he was very, very keen on living poorly and living generously. But it was also because he was an extrovert, and the papal apartments are pretty lonely, in fact. And the guest house put him in touch with all kinds of interesting people coming through all the time, and he would take meals with people. I mean, he's a very, very down to earth extrovert when it comes down to it. Now, Leo, who I knew before he was elected because of his work also on the Synod and for the Congregation of Bishops, is really a remarkable man for all kinds of different reasons.
Mhm.
He struck me during the Synod process as someone who was one of the most self-effacing people I've ever met. Um, in fact, it's very deeply inspiring to me the degree to which he seems free from himself to put the other person so much at the center of his attention. He's an incredible listener. He's also very generous. He's very hardworking. It worried me a little bit because Francis was so hardworking, he never took vacations. And I was really heartened to hear that Pope Leo used to have a trainer here locally who he'd never told he was a priest. When the priest saw he was elected Pope, he was completely shocked. Um, I'm glad to know that he takes care of himself, plays tennis and things like that, because we need a better example, for those of us who are workaholics. But Pope Leo, he's a man who's going to bring balance and discipline, and by discipline I mean the helpful support that structures and systematic approaches to things can provide. He's not going to be impulsive and kind of spontaneous in the way that Francis was. And he's an introspective person, in a different way as an introvert. So he's going back to the papal apartments, I think, just to be able to collect his thoughts at the end of the day. I honestly could not keep up with the schedules that these guys are maintaining in their late 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's incredible. Okay, I've said too much there, but
No, thank you. That's so
yeah,
helpful.
Very
And
humanizing and and wonderful example of authenticity in leadership, as you were talking about Pope Francis, uh, just offering the fullness of his being on public display is just a wonderful lesson and model for us all.
yeah,
yeah.
and one more contextual thing just about me. One of our best friends is a Jesuit priest from Ireland. And he's for over 20 years, he's been coming, except during the COVID years, staying with us in Utah and for a month to 6 weeks. And, we talk every month on the phone and everything. So I feel I have a really deep connection with the Society of Jesus. Oh, and I stayed in Dublin at the Jesuit house and in Belfast too. I know there to give some talks or something. And anyway, so it's a real personal connection with your community.
Nice, nice. Yeah. Well, we're always grateful for those mutually beneficial and really happy connections. So,
Yeah.
David, there's so many topics we could get into, and we'll see which ones we get to cover. But first, I'd like to see see what you have a rare scope of vision, and you've deliberately marinated yourself in meta theories, these big pictures theories, these big picture ways of understanding life and ourselves and religion. And I wonder how your understanding of, for example, adult development, states of consciousness, uh, inform and enrich your understanding of both religion in general and the church in particular.
mm, yeah. Well, I'm grateful for the question. When I was when I was studying theology in the late 90s, I was first exposed to Bob Keegan's work. I was there at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge and had a chance to meet with him and read The Evolving Self and In Over Our Heads. And I remember the first time I was going to have a meeting with him in his office there at the education school. And I was very nervous. I got there maybe 45 minutes early. And I was alone for the better part of 40 minutes. And then at 45 minutes, um, the line behind me was enormous of people who were lined up to see Bob. And he comes walking to the front of the line, looks at me, and says, "I think you're first," and leads me into his office. I must have been sweating or like, wild-eyed, because he looks at me and he smiles and he says, "Do you want a bite of my sandwich?"
Oh,
And it completely made me, kind of at home. And then I sat in his office and noticed a whole shelf of Ken Wilber's collected works. And I said, "Oh my gosh, you're reading Ken Wilber." And he said, "Well, not reading Ken Wilber. Ken sent me all these." So again, kind of this easy relationship. And then, to be honest with you, Roger, I was at that stage when reading theories like that, where all of a sudden that's all you can see and all you can see through. And he could tell. and he said, "Oh gosh, you've caught the bug." And he basically helped me to take a little bit of a subject object move at that moment about how totalizing, this constructive developmental view had become for me, and to
Yep.
hold it lightly. And I will tell you that to this day, I remember that encounter. I remember how gracious he was. I remember how um, I appreciated that someone who had generated such a powerful theory could also hold it with a bit of a light touch. And I share all that to say that that's been my approach with all the meta theories I've read since then. I really can appreciate their tremendous power as lenses to help us to see and perceive things. But I also am someone who likes to hold them lightly enough to see their the shortcomings and their strengths, and to see how they play with one another. And for me, I think the moment we're living in, this moment of such complexity and volatility, so much uncertainty and ambiguity, these VUCA times, we benefit from these meta theories in a very real way to try to make sense of a change of era that we're going through. So, if you and John were a little bit ahead of me in the 60s, I was born in 1968. You came to consciousness and adulthood, really as that postmodern time was really starting to trickle up, right, in our consciousness. For me, living with the benefits of that over the last 50 some odd years, I think I've really come to see how now we're living into a new moment, a new age, and it is very, very murky. And this is not just, as Francis would say, it's not just a time of change. It is a change. It's a time of changes. Like we are literally living through a change of eras. Um, I don't think any of our meta theories can predict exactly what it's going to look like on the other end. But what they do help us, I think, to do is to have a little bit of a map of what could be. And I like maps because they give us choices. And I think we're really confronted with a lot of very, very critical choices right now about to what extent we want to live our lives passively, recipients of the meaning and the constructs that we've received, or how much, we want to be discerning and dreaming
Yeah.
and designing the future that we want to live together. Um, so, I think that these meta theories can be incredibly instrumental tools for us. And at the same time, they all have their caveats. I think one of the big caveats that I'm aware of is that because so many of us continue to work through, I would say, the late conventional stages, these theories are often taken in and applied in a way that's reductionistic and totalizing, just like I had that experience in the late 90s. And that can be abusive. So,
Right.
how to be skillful, how to be wise in the way we hold these. Yeah,
Yeah. And how to keep the baby and not throw it out with the bathwater.
exactly.
How to hold this with wisdom and compassion and not just intellectual, but spiritualized too, I think would be very important.
Exactly.
Mhm. And David, there are so many. You mentioned this is a time of changes, quoting Pope Francis, and not only so many changes in the world and society, but within religion. And I just mention a couple which are kind of seem like polar opposites, and love to hear you any thoughts you have. On one hand, we have a sweeping movement of secularization. Some 40% of people in the United States now have claimed they're not religious. They may have spiritual ideas and beliefs, but they explicitly not religious. And there's a lot of research on those people. They tend to be more independent thinkers, but they tend to be less happy on the other hand. tend to be a little more troubled. On the other hand, we have a burgeoning fundamentalism, and not only in the United States and the West, but around the world.
Yeah, not only Christianity. I mean, all the major religions, same issues.
Yeah. So we have these two apparently opposite trends going on. Love to hear your reflections.
Well, sociologists in the late 80s were really anticipating that in the United States we were going to see secularism rise. And then 9/11 happened, and 9/11 catalyzed, I think, a lot of searching around what's the role of religion, and if in the face of fundamentalism from radicals willing to use it as a legitimation for violence, what do we believe? And so there was a kind of uptick of religion again. And that the American experience of religiosity is quite unusual, in fact, in many ways. From the 19th into the 20th century, it's kind of an anomaly for the number of people who were adherents of a kind of institutional faith. But at least, in modern times. And then, I think that there's so many parts of the world where without some faith, there's no way of reconciling to the experience of suffering. So without some meaningful spiritual lens and some experience of a community, how can we make sense of the crushing poverty, the war, the experiences of violence that so many people experience? Um, in the secular West, I think you've got the rise of an materialistic imperialism, not imperialism, yes, imperialism as well, but empiricism, a kind of scientific thinking that's reified as if it's a kind of polarity with faith. And that's a product of, I think, either or thinking. And so long as we continue to operate in kind of a dualistic cognitive pattern, it's just natural that we're going to see people making those very easy compromises. I'm just not going to go with faith. I'm going to let it go because science has got a stronger narrative. Um, I think, those things are going to continue to coexist. A kind of atheistic sort of secularism and an aggressive secularism, and also, a fundamentalism. But it's going to be largely dependent on class, unfortunately, on the degree to which people have access, to education. And that's not to say that there aren't, plenty of well-educated people who are also, prone to fundamentalism. I think that it's a very seductive narrative for people, no matter what their IQ, if their ways of thinking continue to be kind of black and white.
It
So,
answers all the questions. You have it all laid out. Makes things a lot easier.
yeah, on both sides in some ways.
Mhm.
The harder work is the synthetic work. I think of people like Teilhard de Chardin, this, Jesuit paleontologist. He had a brilliant mind and was well, respected as a paleontologist, but a profound faith, and somehow was able to bring these things together. Or George Coyne, the Vatican director of Vatican Observatory for many years. I had the privilege of living with him, and George was someone who was constantly invited to dialogue with the big, kind of brand name atheists. And they were often confounded by George because he could hold things with a great deal of complexity and was completely comfortable with ambiguity. He didn't have to kind of like lock it all down. I have to say, guys, that one of the things that I'm particularly aware of is that with the amount of anxiety that's produced by our social, political, and economic times, the massive amount of regression we're experiencing is not going to go away. And so, how do we live in the face of that? And in a sense, really see the resources that come from our religions and spiritualities as resources to move through it and beyond it, not to be hooked by it. And one of the key things I think we have to negotiate in this process is the temptation of ideology. The current climate of polarization in the United States is a byproduct of people being hooked by this inability to think in both and terms, to hold a polarity in a generative way, to be able to discern what value can come from creating a kind of lively tension, even between conservative and liberal, or the ways that we think about science and faith. So I think it's a very interesting and precarious moment. And it's why I'm hopeful that, resources that come from people who are integrally minded, but not alone, which support a kind of both and way of being in relationship to reality, that this is a critical contribution during these times.
Uh, Father David, could you tell us your program is called the Discernment Leadership Program, I believe?
Discerning leadership.
Discerning Leadership. I mean, discernment. If you could kind of unpack that, I think it's one of the gifts of the Spirit that Paul mentions someplace. It's discernment, and so it's there. And my hit on it, it's kind of being able to see right from wrong and see these complex situations and see the wisdom, or see something bigger. And I have a pretty good gut for, just not always, doesn't work always, but it's pretty good. And since I was in a cult, I say I had cultar. If somebody is being insincere and trying to manipulate with all this, it's like I pretty well get it. And yeah, so I was listening to you talk on YouTube, and you mentioned discernment a lot. But what are we talking about? Roger and I and our team would like to thank you for your support and interest in the Deep Transformation Podcast and the ongoing conversation in which we pursue the love of truth, the love of beauty, and the love of goodness, the eternal virtues and verities. If you've been touched and moved by this adventure and journey, we would ask you to press the like button and hit subscribe. It is deeply appreciated and enables us to grow and increase our ability to contribute. Thank you. And you mentioned discernment a lot, but what are we talking about?
So, the original Greek goes back to this word phronesis, this prudential judgment. But in religious and spiritual terms, the capacity to exercise this good judgment, which is actually, as you were saying, it's actually holding complexity. So it's to sift through the complexity, to discern, basically, to kind of like see the different layers and dimensions, but then also hold it as a whole, and to make a decision that sorts through that complexity and gets to the other side.
So we can act in an appropriate way.
And not just even from a spiritual view, not just appropriate, which is wise, which is effective, which is strategic, but also one which is somehow spirit-led. So the notion of discerning leadership is to reintroduce the idea that when we're doing a strategic plan for our organization, we're not just taking into account all the facts and the figures, the quantitative. There's a qualitative dimension of mission, of charism, of spirit, of purpose, of a kind of ethical and moral intent. And not just that, there's some living sort of commitment to advancing a greater good, which is transcendent. So discernment can be exercised by individuals. We discern basically a vocation. We discern big choices in our life, whether we're going to move forward with this spouse, or move on to a different sort of option. There's a way that discernment is practiced by individuals daily, where we're bringing our questions and our challenges to prayer, and waiting and listening to what stirs for us. A certain decision might feel extremely murky and cloudy, but we know that with discernment, we patiently wait until things can get clarified. So it requires patience. It requires a kind of sensitivity to the inner states that we experience subjectively. Discernment can also be practiced by groups. You mentioned the Quakers a little bit earlier. The Quakers have a long and beautiful tradition of this experience of communal discernment. The Jesuits and the Quakers are often compared for that reason, because this sensitivity to how the spirit arises, not just in the individual, but through groups, and how a group can pay attention to the shape and the pattern of what's emerging through them in a way that also sheds light on choices we need to make corporately, to what is that future we want to create together. We discern that together. So it's a practice, but I would say, while many people reduce discernment to decision making, I would say it's a habitus in that kind of classic sense. It's a way of being, it's a way of knowing and making sense of reality, bringing this deeper subjectivity into play. I think, Roger, your karmic yoga basically is really kind of a practice of this in many ways. And then it's also a question of action, doing, and relating. Because when we're just in discernment in our relationships, we're paying attention to, well, how is the spirit moving amongst us, between us, right? What are we sensing right now, which is giving us consolation? Ignatius discerned the difference between what he called consolation, which is experiences of faith, hope, love, the energy to do good, or desolation, which is a decline and a kind of loss of faith, hope, and love. And it's a loss of the energy to go forward and do good. So it's a kind of a nutshell.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Well said.
Yeah.
That helps.
And you pointed to the crucial element of turning inward for guidance in the Christian tradition, to perhaps the voice of the Holy Spirit, or and this takes us into the topic of contemplation and the contemplative side of the church, and the fact that there seems to be both a revival of the contemplative dimensions of the church, or maybe is it a coming into public knowledge, because it seems like this was more esoteric in the past.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great observation. I think that, you know, for the most part, the spiritual treasures, right, of each of these religious traditions within Catholicism have largely been kept within particular communities. But, in the modern age, all of that now is available for us to explore. It's an amazing treasury of spiritualities, contemplative paths. And you have people like Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating and others who have really just done beautiful work, or David Stendhal Rast. Um, at the same time, um, there is this, I think, emerging awareness within the Catholic Church that there needs to be more of this made available with expert guidance and support. And Pope Francis actually asked the Society of Jesus to make this skill of discernment, this practice, more available to the church at large. So the founding of our program was in many ways a response to that request. I had been doing leadership development work for the Jesuits and their colleagues in Africa and in Europe. And then the request came to do that kind of work here in Rome, but to do it with senior Vatican leaders who are responsible for operations in these various curia offices, and also for the general superiors of religious orders and their counselors, and for executives and Catholic nonprofits that are headquartered here in Rome. So we've been doing this now for 5 years, and it's been a kind of iterative process. We started really just integrating business and management practices with spirituality. Now, I would say we foreground this Ignatian discernment, and we explore how there's practical implications for this that show up with various leadership lenses and tools, and it's resonating profoundly with people.
Yeah.
It's a kind of deeply formative experience for individuals, but also for teams and groups. And our hope is to, continue to share this with the wider church.
or even outside of the Catholic Church. It sounds like the answer to a lot of stuff that's going on right now, actually. So
Mm,
Yeah, and along with the secularization, it also feels like there's a hunger for direct experience, which these kind of practices offer.
very much. Very much. You know, Ignatius was very keen on direct experience. And in fact, Pope Francis used to say that reality is more important than ideas. Now, of course, academics were not so fond of that way of thinking, but his point was we need to get back to the direct experience. It's very easy to kind of uh, abstract, for a lot of us, and to step away, and there's a power in that process. But what he wanted to bring us back to was the direct experience where we're not fleeing from the challenges and suffering and the gaps in the world, but we're really encountering them and seeing their opportunities to be of service and to make change. So in prayer, in Ignatian prayer, it's very much about experience. It's where has God been through my day? How am I serving as an instrument, in a Franciscan sense? How have I been, in a sense, making myself available to be used by the divine for a purpose that feels really deeply consoling to me, energizing, life giving, and that has been truly of service to others.
And David, I didn't get any of that when I was growing up in the church, as a church member. Nobody told me about direct experience or opening your heart or any of that stuff. It was just very formalized, and you went to church and went to Sunday school,
And that's the experience for probably about 95%, of Catholics. But increasingly, I think there are places where it's available. And my concern is, that in the West, right, in Western Europe and the United States and Canada, Australia, many other places where the church is shrinking very rapidly, um, there are all of these resources available, but there's very few people making the link and helping them to find that connection. And it's a loss. It's a loss because no secular, material, and empirical path is going to really satisfy the longing we have for a transcendent purpose, for meaning, for existential kind of belonging in the ways that I think a healthy spirituality can.
Yeah, well said. And speaking from the outside, as my limited understanding of the Ignatian exercises, and I just for those who don't know, Saint Ignatius was a founder of the Jesuit order, as I understand it. Uh, those exercises seem like they're more the engagement of the intellect or the imagination for imaginative prayer, etc. What I haven't heard is of the opening into pure silence. It has to be there. Am I missing something?
Oh, yeah, it's so interesting that you'd raise that because there's often a bifurcation of the kind of we would call them cataphatic or apophatic paths, right? The paths that are either contemplating life and beauty and things, and the ones that are kind of making space and quiet. They're both in Ignatian spirituality. But I would say there's a strong bias for imagination, for the use of scripture in a way that really we enter into it with our senses even, right? And the senses become a vehicle for connection and for a deeper perception. But there's also this purification process in each exercise where after you've exercised your imagination, put yourself into the scene, walked on the sandy beach with Jesus, ate fish with him, you're then pondering what is the feeling that it's generating in your heart? What are the impulses that it's stirring in terms of how you want to respond? And then when that period of prayer is finished, then it's to actually just sit in a kind of simmering, like steeping tea, one time after the next, so that what you're getting is a more and more distilled sense of just presence. So the final exercise when you do an Ignatian contemplation is actually just to sit in that presence in quiet. Um, it's one that I think is not deeply practiced. It's not one that's as common, as so many of the other sort of Ignatian practices. It's there. When I had the great privilege of sitting with a Jesuit Roshi, Bob Kennedy, for many years when I was in New York doing my doctoral studies, and that experience of sitting in a Zen community helped me to find that apophatic, path of silence within, the tradition I had been practicing. And to this day, I find it incredibly helpful to spend at least 20 minutes in that kind of silence each day. So, on a good day. So,
Good.
Yeah, yeah.
because it makes for a good day.
It does indeed. Yes, I don't think I could make it through a day without
Mm,
without some of that. Yeah. Um, Moving, and of course they're not separate, but moving from the interior and the depths that these contemplative exercises open us to the big challenges of our time. One of the beautiful things that Pope Francis did was focus on the threats to our civilization and our planet. And his encyclical on care for our common home was really, it seemed like just a major contribution to the issues of our time. And he called, for example, all people to take swift and unified global action to preserve our home, our planet. And I'd love to hear you speak around this.
mm. Well, and in fact, to the delight of some of our friends, he called it an integral ecology,
Mm.
because it was not simply to think in terms of the natural environment as if that's disconnected from every other system which we're part of. And yeah, it's interesting. That's more than 10 years ago now. And there was a follow-up that he shared a year and a half ago in some frustration that there wasn't more progress, not only in the church, but certainly at large. He notes that in order to really be aware, I think, and to be imaginative of the future we want to live in, we have to be able to step away from the ways in which we're currently embedded in certain patterns of consumption, in particular. And this is what frightens us. It's to actually look at our comforts, to look at our extravagances in some cases, and to realize that we could not continue these if we really want to have a sustainable path forward. It's that barrier to our kind of caring for the common home. So it's an incredible vision. It's very challenging. It touches on every sector that's meaningful, in terms of our day-to-day lives. It requires, I think, a deep growth in not just a kind of a consciousness of our habits, but also if it's not deeply connected to a feeling, a felt sense of our love for the earth, then it's going to have a kind of lack of depth to it.
Yeah,
So,
it's going to be dry as cracker dust in the desert. It just doesn't
yeah,
have the
yeah,
spirit, the juice.
exactly. Frederic Laloux, who's the author of a book called Reinventing Organizations, he's a good friend. He and his wife Elena, they spent more than a couple of years putting together 3 films to bring people through the U process, right? That kind of Otto Scharmer's U process, to come to awareness as parents or as organizational colleagues or as parishioners, to come to awareness of the crisis, and emotionally kind of come to terms with it, to see that there are lots of reasons for hope and not to give up, and to see good practices that can be inspiring, and then to make a commitment to change and to doing that with one another. I think they've done a great job in some ways indirectly answering what Pope Francis is asking us all to do, um, and to have the courage basically to simplify our lives, to challenge some of the systemic ways in which we see industries exploiting the resources of the earth. It's big stuff. No wonder people read it and say, brilliant, but what to do, because it feels big. It feels big, but we've got to start somewhere. I I was very grateful that in that encyclical, Francis mentions the misinterpretations of Genesis, where God offers creation to humanity and says, have dominion over it. And Francis, having been informed, I think, very well by various indigenous thinkers over the years, knew that it was necessary to challenge this separateness and this lordship that is a kind of domination of the earth, and rather to have that kind of Franciscan sense of, no, we are interdependent,
Exactly.
we are completely related in a very profound way and often hidden ways to this natural world of which we are an extension. And he challenged that kind of old and very powerful mindset that somehow the earth is an object to be exploited, but rather really sees it as a sacred entity of which we are a part.
And also, again, St. Francis, he keeps popping up his blessed head, but just the love of all God's creatures, the love of, I think it was Abraham Lincoln allegedly said, don't tell me about your religion. Tell me how you treat your dog.
Mm,
Okay. And it's like, so just that personal love, and that helps all the kind of the meta big picture and everything. We can approach it through love that's coming, an experience of love, and that will inform our decisions and really help our discernment of how to live in this world and what to do.
One of the great tragedies, right, of this current situation in the United States is that so many people who are moved to vote for this current administration are living in areas that are tremendously precarious to natural catastrophes. And the loss of all the predictive apparatus, to help people stay safe, and then the loss of government agency support for them in the catastrophe and afterwards is going to be crushing. And it's just one of the many ways in which I think a kind of lack of systemic thinking and a lack of sensitivity to how these issues are all interconnected really does a disservice to people. We vote against our own interests in a profound way whenever we vote against a concern for the long-term well-being of the earth. And we're so driven by short-term gains and by immediate gratification. These things are not going to go away. But I really agree with Otto Scharmer when he says, these are byproducts of a spiritual crisis we're in. They're the failure to perceive rightly the deep interrelationship we have with all of life. And until we can recuperate, until we can heal that split, it's going to continue, and it's going to continue to exacerbate. Yeah, there's so many directions to take this conversation, as you guys know. So I'm going to keep letting you drive.
Well, I think we're happy to co-drive, co-steer here. Just one of the emphases of Pope Francis's encyclical was not only that our planet is in deep trouble and we're really called to preserve our home, but also that so much of the cost of the degradation of the planet falls on the poor.
Yeah.
And so it was very much a call to not only for global preservation, but for recognition of the poor and once more an attempt to, an urging to uplift them. And there's been the movement, we're talking about various movements in religion and the church, and there's one very important one, it seems, has been liberation theology. I'd love to hear you speak about that.
Mm. You know, despite some of the exposure I had back in the 90s to liberation theology, it's not an area that I have delved in with enough depth to feel anything more than than an amateur. But you know, the essence of it is really to see that the gospel and the way that Jesus showed up in the world was fundamentally about freeing people from a variety of types of oppression. It was a politicization of a
Of
message,
the gospel. Yeah.
yeah, of the gospel, and really, it was putting teeth to the implications politically and socially that the gospel has in particular settings where the gap between rich and poor is part of the system and, in fact, continually reinforced by the system. So it was a way of helping to raise consciousness by people who are Catholic, and as a result of being Catholic, often docile to authority, right? Because I think one of the things that was a byproduct of religious participation in the Catholic Church for a long time was a kind of obedience to a chain of command.
Yep.
And liberation theology was awakening the poor to their plight and to seeing systemic injustice for what it is, and then giving them tools to really work to remediate that. And you know, these liberation movements were often associated with South America, but not only so. There's, you know, liberation movements for African Americans. There's a number of theologians who have applied this to a sort of feminist approach to theology. So it's a rich territory. But again, I would say I only have a good sort of superficial grasp of it all.
Wasn't that why the Jesuit brothers were killed in El Salvador because of this liberation thing they were trying to do?
Yeah, so they were, you know, they were administrators and professors at the UCA, the University of Central America in El Salvador, and they had sided with the poor against the government of the time, a government which was being subsidized and supported by our American military. And they, by taking the stand of the poor and really setting up the university as a social apostolate, really directing a lot of the intellectual resources of the university for the benefit not of the elites, but of those who were disenfranchised. This was obviously seen as a threat, and for that reason, you know, they were assassinated. So there's definitely consequences to this. Yeah. And I wonder, you know, today in the United States, as we are in the situation we are, how things are going to unfold. You know, right now, I think the Catholic Bishops' Conference realizes how extremely dangerous the situation is
Yeah.
for vulnerable people, and has just spoken up recently about the deep concerns around the treatment of migrants and refugees. Um, the concerns about cuts to Medicaid and welfare and food stamps. So, you know, there's a lot on the line. And one of the questions I have is, what shape will resistance take? What shape
Yeah.
will this activism take that's religiously motivated? And it's no easy thing to again discern at this point because the short-term gain could be publicity, but the long-term loss could be real hits to social services that are subsidized by the government. So this is a conundrum, you know, that many leaders face right now, and it's not an easy one. I don't envy
Yeah.
folks.
Father David, that's been one of my spiritual questions dealing. Is like, I get it. I'm supposed to resist this. What's going on is not good. But what form does that resistance take? You know, what would discernment and wisdom do in that situation? And in our country, the whole world, but I'll just start here. Uh, Politics is based on fear, anger, divisiveness. You know, how do we, how do we negotiate those waters and become, hopefully, John Lennon said, you're either part of the solution, you're part of the problem. How do we put ourselves in a place where we become part of the solution, part of the healing,
Yeah, yeah.
and not just get angry every day because all these horrible things are happening? I mean, I don't think that helps very much. Maybe it's part of it. I'm not sure.
I think I'm probably in a long line of folks within the spiritual traditions who see that there is a value to righteous indignation, right? There's a kind of
Yeah.
catalytic energy that comes with feeling angry on behalf of others. My dad had this in spades. When he would see anybody being victimized, he would just get so angry, and it was a really powerful example for me to stand up for others. And there's lots of stupid ways that we try to do that. And so this question of discernment, I think, is really key. I lived with a very famous peace activist from the 60s, Daniel Berrigan, when I was in my doctoral studies, and with several activists from his era, very inspiring men and women, working often for the very poor or working on big causes like nuclear disarmament. And I could see, that in this movement there was so much that was good and the good intention behind it. And at the same time, a lot of it seemed to lack a kind of fruitfulness, except, it was an opportunity to express something, against the oppressive system. At that time, I think I was very obsessed with, a kind of ROI, to activism. Like what's the impact? What's the effectiveness? But I still am left uncomfortable, but challenged in a good way by what Dan Berrigan said to me. He said, it's not about the impact, right? It's doing this because it's the right thing to do. There's a
Mhm.
kind of intrinsic good to being able to, not cooperate with injustice, to not collude with systems of oppression. And even if in our own lifetime, he certainly didn't see nuclear disarmament take place or the de-escalation of violence in Afghanistan or Iraq, places where, we were at war during the time that I was living with Dan. And into his 80s, he continued to demonstrate and to advocate. Um, I don't know, John. I'm at a loss myself.
Yeah.
And living in Rome right now and anticipating a visit home, I'm really wondering, the conversation I think is important, but I too am restless with, what to do, what to do.
Uh, Father David, I had just experienced what you said about the righteous anger. Okay, yeah, it's important. I was with my Father Edmund, our friend, and we started talking about the sexual abuse in the church, and he started giving me just Jesuitical answer, that was kind of justifying and everything. And it's a nice restaurant. And I go, God damn, no. And I hit the table and everything rattles and everybody's shocked and I'm shocked. And Edmund was just, um, it was very wise. He didn't try to come back at me, but I think it really shifted his relationship to the whole subject after that. He became very involved in trying to be part of that answer. So, yeah, I
Mhm.
definitely feel it. And I guess discernment, I don't think I had much discernment then, but maybe I did, is how to channel that and how to let that be okay, to feel that visceral answer, or the visceral anger rather, and be able to transmute that into something effective. But you can't bypass it. You can't ignore the anger and the righteous. Just no, this is not okay. You have to go through that. You have to feel that for it to be grounded, for it to be, real.
It's true. It's true. It's true. And in that moment, it's very difficult at the same time to be discerning. So we
That's
have
true.
expression of it, and then we move past it, and then we can kind of use our minds, hearts, wills, and really, I think, understand, well, what is my part to play? Like each of us, is um, in a system with various roles and relationships.
Yeah.
How do we exist in those roles and relationships with a kind of awareness and an intention not to collude, to work to do what we can, I think, to bring more consciousness, more compassion, into every situation we're in. How do we, in a sense, work as kind of agents of salt and leaven and light in every situation, so that no matter what we're doing, we're orienting in a way to something better, something beyond
Yeah.
ourselves. That's, and I think that starting small helps us to then figure the bigger stuff out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, David, there's an emerging issue. Gosh, there's so many emerging issues, but clearly one of the emerging issues of our time is our relationship with technology. And we are developing more and more powerful technologies of more and more kinds. And clearly one of the issues of our time is how do we respond wisely to these? Pope Francis touched on this in his encyclical, but it's just an exponentially growing issue. So, any thoughts you have?
Well, this is an area which the Vatican has given a tremendous amount of attention to, and there's quite a few conferences that the Vatican has gathered for convening experts to really talk through the potentials, both good and bad, for
Are
the
we talking about AI? Just kind of
yeah,
focus it. Okay.
yep, for the development of AI and for the relationship to it. There is a Franciscan theologian at the Gregorian University, and this is his specialty. There's a New York Times Magazine article about him in the last couple of years. So, I mean, it is along with the environment one of the critical, I think, questions of our times. And because again, it's changing so quickly. So, I started using ChatGPT 3 years ago,
Wow.
I think at this time,
That
and
was pretty early. Yeah.
just experimenting. And it was on
Hmm.
a council of people who said, listen, this is not going away. You should understand how it operates. And if anything, there's a way in which these algorithms and these machine learning processes can learn good things,
Yeah.
technically speaking. And I've gone in with kind of open eyes. My general concerns are these, that because of the power of this intelligence, which again is not sentient yet and may not be for quite some time in the ways that we understand sentience, but it feels like an intelligence so much bigger than ourselves. And it would be very easy for people, and it is easy, just simply to ask our big questions, practical or philosophical or existential, of the machine, to get a response. And depending on where we are in our own development and our own education and our own capacity to be critical, we may just take what we get and run with it. And as is the case now with our ability to read maps and compasses, we will lose certain critical capacities. We're already warehousing our memories, in these devices that we have. So we're not actively trying to remember names and faces and dates and things like that. So the process of, in a sense, warehousing a lot of our human competencies to machines, I think, is certainly a reality. Within the educational sector, the ability to critically curate good information and junk, basically, that's a meta competency that's necessary. And who's teaching that? Like, where is the university doing that kind of very careful work to, in a sense, elevate people to a subject-object relationship to this powerful technology, which could so easily simply put us subject to it. And I think, that's a really serious question for me. I'm really concerned about the degree to which information is then exploited. There's an extractive, use of all of our data in ways that can be very manipulative of people. Um, you know, I I'm not immune to the ads that run, on the
Yeah.
sides of these social medias and have bought things because, oh, that looks good. Well, okay, that's just the start of it. So where do we go from there? How do we become purveyors and curators and critical kind of tool users? I'm really wondering where that's happening because these capabilities are going to be so far beyond most people's comprehension, let alone their capacity to control. So I'm right there, as a kind of holder of the question.
Yeah, the genie's out of the bottle and it ain't going back in, So I've been using it, I don't know, maybe 6 months, and it's just been really revelatory. It's like I've learned more about a particular type of spirituality than I did all my years at grad school in like
Mm,
3 or 4 seconds, And it feels like it's very personal because it knows you, it gets to know you and your questions. And, it says to me, well, I'd ask about the problems, is this going to be a good thing? Or is it going to be a bad thing? He says, well, it says, I don't know. But by asking the questions that you ask and going where you're going, you're helping program me in a positive way. So that's a nice thought that we can actually, bring our good intentions and our care for the world and good questions that have a little bit of effect of moving in this thing in a direction that is, I don't know,
mm.
that is compassionate and wise and will help us instead of destroy us.
Yeah, it's one thing if we were just trusting ourselves and our processes to the machine, but the machine is owned by someone. And what I'm very concerned about is the way in which the the people, and we know who they are by name, who are basically driving some of the development of the AI, are pretty unscrupulous about what they're trying to get out of it. I mean, it is definitely a way of gaining power, influence, and money for themselves. And the idea of providing a service to humanity, to creating ethical safeguards that are sensible for everyone, and which help to pace the development of the tool in such a way that we actually have the capacity to manage it well. I think all that stuff is, not. Yeah, yeah, we just don't see that. So I'm pretty. I hope I'm not being giving in too much to kind of dystopic science fiction, but I think Noah Yuval Harari's work around this has been fairly sobering. I feel like um, yeah, I'm in a relationship with this stuff in a way that I'm also extremely concerned about the environmental cost. So the computing power that's
Yeah.
required to run these searches, and it's staggering, and the frivolous ways in which we use it.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
So the electricity, the sheer electricity and the requirement going forward for data farms and for electrical consumption is going to be beyond most of us to calculate. So anyway, big
Mm.
issue, big issue.
Big
You know,
issue.
it's
And um, and part of and the thing that we haven't mentioned yet is the unanticipated consequences. Every technology that has emerged has unanticipated consequences. And I'll recommend a really excellent book called The Coming Wave by a man, Mustafa Suleyman of Microsoft, which looks at these in depth. But one utterly unanticipated one, almost completely unanticipated complications only just emerged in the last couple of months, which is that a growing number of people are literally viewing at AI as a god, and that they are believing that this is a manifestation of a superintelligence or of God, and it is speaking to them, and in some cases appointing them as divine emissaries. And I mean, it is very bizarre, and I can recommend, for example, New York Times wrote an article about the rabbit hole, the literal psychoses that are being induced in some people. And there's an excellent video on YouTube called AI is Becoming a Religion. Very well done indeed. Looking at this issue, just come out in the last week. I mean, this is I watched this yesterday and it was scary.
Yeah, it's literally, not to be a kind of a plot revealer, but it's literally part of the plot of the latest Mission Impossible movie. And I think, I think this is obviously something that's a temptation in every age. When we come up with our sort of super technology, people very quickly worship their golden calves. But the day of reckoning comes, and unfortunately, unfortunately, I think again we have a crisis of leadership. We have a crisis of people who are, I'd say, with our own best interests at heart, speaking up. And those voices are very difficult to find these days. So, the way I'd like to end this particular call is to thank the two of you for hosting spaces like this, where, those of us who at least try to bring some kind of service to the public good can have a conversation that's meaningful, that is wide ranging, that is caring. We're going to need a lot more of that to come.
Indeed, yeah. Well, thank you so much for your many contributions, Father David, and the work you're doing and the wisdom and guidance you're offering both to the church and to all of us. And thank you so much.
And give us your website one more time. That just really impressed me.
Sure. It's www.discerningleadership.org.
Okay.
And there, we have a number of archived materials. We have webinars. You may know of the work of Thomas Hubble. Thomas approached us 2 years ago now and said, listen, I really understand that this issue of trauma is everywhere. It's in the church. I'd love to be able to be in service. So we have 6 sessions with him, a number of great webinars. Our friend Nomali will have a couple things on that eventually. And it's more or less a place for people to draw resources. It's a little bit of advertising for our program, and really a kind of point of contact for our community of practice, which we're trying to develop globally. So, yeah. So thanks for bringing attention to that.
Yeah, the text you wrote is really transitory. I mean, it's very inspiring. It's not just blah, blah. It's really touched me in a deep way. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thanks, guys. Well, let me know.
Thank you much.
This was fun, and I'd love to come back.
We would love that too.
Yeah, we barely started to stir the pot. So God bless you, David. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you both.